Hello all. Today we're going to explore the origins of one of the most well-known playground rhymes of all time. London Bridge is falling down. When was the rhyme first sung? Why was London Bridge in such disrepair? Is there any truth in the story the rhyme tells the grisly tale of walling people up in the foundations of bridges for good luck? And who was the fair lady? I thought it would also be a chance to have a look at the history of London Bridge and its significance to the making of London. Let's start with the rhyme as we know it today. The modern version, which is also a playground game in which two children form an arch and the others proceed through, is much like that other London-based song, Oranges and Lemons, which I plan to do a video about. The rhyme starts with the verse, which I'm not going to sing, London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down, London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady. There then follows a series of verses suggesting ways to mend the bridge. Here are just some suggestions I found in nursery rhyme anthologies. But anything could be used, wood and clay and bricks and mortar, iron and steel. But I suspect every playground in the English-speaking world has invented their own fun combination of materials to try and fix the bridge, but apparently to no avail, and each verse ends with the refrain, my fair lady. The critical point, I suppose, is that nothing works, until silver and gold is suggested, at which point it's agreed that might work so long as there's a watchman to guard the bridge, and even then, in some renditions, there's a need for a chained-up dog to protect the whole affair. We'll come back to the possible significance of the watchman and the dog later. First, let's explore the history of the rhyme. Originally, London Bridge was a dance, and can be traced back to at least the reign of Charles II in the mid-17th century. Iona and Peter Opie note that by 1720 it was seen as a children's verse, but still with a dancing component. The tune now associated with the rhyme was first recorded in 1879 in the United States in the Illustrated National Songs and Games. The earliest printed version is Tom Thumb's Pretty Songbook in 1744, and it ran as follows. London Bridge is broken down, dance over my Lady Lee, London Bridge is broken down, with the gay lady. There doesn't appear to have been a definitive version of the rhyme until late in the 19th century, but the Lady Lee makes regular appearances, and we'll discover who she might be later. So what should we make of all this? The first thing to say is that there was, and indeed still is, a London Bridge. Not that one, that's Tower Bridge. This is London Bridge, or at least the newest version of it, a Brutalist carbuncle opened in 1973. How about this one? This is the less new London Bridge, built to the designs of John Rennie and opened in 1831, so long after the rhyme was known. But let's have a quick look anyway. There was actually a competition on who should design the bridge, which Rennie actually lost, but the board decided to select his design anyway after he'd built Southwark and Waterloo bridges, and upon completion of London Bridge he was knighted. It served London until it was decided it was too narrow for modern traffic, and ironically it was falling down, or rather sinking into the silt of the river, and would have to be replaced. It was famously bought by oil and chainsaw tycoon Robert P. McCulloch, and moved block by block to its current location, Lake Havasu City, in Arizona. There's a myth that he intended to buy Tower Bridge, but there's no truth to this at all. A section of Rennie's Bridge does remain on the south side of the River Thames, including what colloquially is known as Nancy Steps, to the left of this picture. They're named after the tragic figure Nancy in Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, who was murdered by Bill Sikes. There's even a blue plaque retelling the tale. In fact, while some important scenes in the novel do take place at London Bridge, the murder of Nancy actually happened back in their lodgings, but the steps are used as a backdrop for the murder in the musical film Oliver. Indeed, the steps and Rennie's Bridge didn't even exist when the novel was set. Dickens describes it as taking place at the time of the ancient London Bridge, which brings us to the old river crossings and the possible origins for the rhyme. The first bridge over the Thames was built by the Romans. At that time the river was much wider than it is today, with reed beds on the banks, and it's thought there were some small islands in the centre of the river. The Romans chose this spot because it was the highest point of the turning of the tide. Although it seems when the Romans left Britain at the end of the 4th century the bridge fell into disrepair, there's no chance the rhyme could go back anything like this far. The first theory, which is mentioned in some of the books on the meaning of the nursery rhyme, does take us back over 1,000 years to the time of the Vikings. In the early 11th century, the throne of England changed hands a number of times between the Viking king Svein Forkbeard and the Anglo-Saxon Ethelred, known as the Unready, which is often translated as ill-advised rather than not ready for something. When Svein died in 1013, in the uncertainty that followed, Ethelred took advantage and planned to seize the throne. With his, at least according to this image, very big sword, and his Norwegian ally Olav Haraldsson, they planned to retake London. The biggest strategic target was London Bridge, but Olaf had a plan. His men would sneak up the river at night, fasten cables around the piles supporting the bridge, take those lines of ships waiting downstream, and when the tide was right, his oarsmen would row with all their might, the bridge would fall, and London would be liberated. So, in the aftermath, there was need to rebuild the fallen London Bridge. There's quite a few problems with this theory, and I only really include it in the video because it's cited so often in the books and nursery rhymes. First, any rhyme from so long ago would be in Old English, and it would have to survive for roughly 750 years without leaving any trace in the records, but at the same time be adapted from Old English to Middle English to Modern English. The second problem is the tale of the destruction of the most important bridge in the kingdom is absent from the main English source for the period, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. It seems unlikely to me that they would have forgotten such a major incident. The actual source for the story is the Saga of the Norse Kings by Snorri Sturluson. However, he was born 2 centuries after the events, and we know from his other works that he didn't always follow the sources very closely. The third and final problem with this theory, as I see it, is the idea that you could pull a bridge away from its foundations just using ropes. Even for the Vikings this seems unlikely. The bridge may have fallen or been burnt in 1014, but we've got no record of it. A much more likely basis for the rhyme is the bridge which was built a few centuries later. This bridge would serve London for over 600 years and be part of the lives of so many famous people of the city. Here it is in a manuscript, and the earliest image we have of the old London Bridge, from the 12th century. By this time, London was in desperate need of a more substantial river crossing. Meanwhile, Henry II had promised, as part of his penitence following the murder of Thomas Becket, to build a new bridge across the Thames. At the centre of this bridge would be a chapel dedicated to Becket, and acting as a starting point for pilgrims travelling from the city of London to Canterbury to visit Becket's tomb. So in 1176, a religious community, the Chaplain Brethren and Sisters of the Bridge of London, were entrusted to build the first stone bridge in the city. The master builder was a parish priest, Peter of Colchurch off Cheapside. This was a serious undertaking. It took 33 years to build, and when completed was 900 feet long, with 19 irregular stone arches. In the middle was a drawbridge, and a church at each end. The eagle-eyed among you will have noticed the bridge had a number of buildings placed on top. This practice was started by King John as a means of paying for the construction, and by 1400 there were as many as 140 shops and businesses. London Bridge was a major gateway for merchants from all over the world to trade their goods. Shops selling gold, silver, furs and exotic spices were set up. These types of bridges were quite common across Europe. Paris had the Pont Notre Dame, and Florence had the Ponte Vecchio, which remains to this day. But London was the longest and most ambitious bridge of this type. In many ways it defined the city for centuries. Perhaps the most famous aspect of London Bridge today was its use as the location where heads of traitors were displayed on spikes, originally on the drawbridge at the centre of the bridge, and later on the south side. Apparently the practice started with the Scottish rebel leader William Wallace and continued for over 350 years. But there was a problem. The original foundations had not accounted for quite so many buildings, and the medieval houses were a major fire hazard. It's a combination of these factors which take us back to the rhyme, that London Bridge was in constant need of repair. In 1212, just 5 years after its completion, there was a major fire across the city. Crowds fled to the bridge to avoid the flames. Sadly, the fire broke out on both ends of the bridge simultaneously, trapping those taking shelter. Perhaps as many as 3,000 people perished in the flames or were drowned trying to escape. In 1281, an arch collapsed. This was followed a year later when a further 5 arches collapsed, and in 1381 the peasants' revolt meant that rich merchants' houses were attacked on the bridge. In 1437 there was a further arch collapse, and the arches were repaired over the following 35 years. Meanwhile, in 1450, merchant houses were attacked again, this time in Jack Cade's rebellion. When the rebellion failed, Cade's head would end up on a spike on the bridge. The Great Fire of London of 1666 burnt 1/3 of the houses on the bridge. Ironically, as a result of an earlier fire in 1633, there was a gap between the buildings which acted as a fire break between the north and south sides of the river and prevented the entire bridge being destroyed. So all told, and not including the minor repairs which were going on throughout this time, the bridge was in a pretty sorry state, and nothing apparently could fix it. It was also not much fun if you had to cross the bridge. By the Tudor period, thanks to the overhanging shop frontages, the roadway was only 6 feet wide in each direction, meaning traffic had to process as single file. It could take up to an hour to cross the bridge. That is, after you've paid the toll. No wonder people were making rhymes up about the problems of the bridge. An interesting byproduct of the narrow arches and piers was the effect it had on the flow of the river. The difference in water levels from one side of the bridge to the other was as much as 6 feet, and only the foolhardy attempted to so-called shoot the bridge. The saying went, the bridge was for wise men to pass over, and fools to pass under. The arches also slowed the flow of the river, so that in hard winters, which were relatively common in the Middle Ages when Britain experienced a mini-ice age, the river froze. This meant there were regular winter festivals actually taking place on the river, but the ice further compressed and damaged the piers and meant further repairs were required. By the 18th century, the houses on the bridge were in the Georgian style, but following another fire in 1725, the period of house building was coming to an end. The last house was built on the bridge in 1745. By this point, the city fathers had had enough. The houses had to go, and as the port of London was developing, the central arch was too narrow for the movement of sailing ships. By 1746, the city corporation started to purchase and demolish the houses. During the demolition, a wooden bridge was built alongside the old bridge. It opened in 1757, but guess what? It burnt down and collapsed 6 months later. This is an image of the bridge with the houses removed and the great arch in place. But this weakened the bridge further, and constant repairs were needed. Basically, the bridge was always falling down. For almost its entire history, London Bridge had been the only crossing point in the centre of London, hence the name London Bridge. But it was mostly used by traders moving goods on carts. Those who needed to cross the river quickly used boatmen or wherries. These were small rowing boats which traversed the river like taxis. It was the power of the wherrymen and the Bridge House estate who collected the tolls for the bridge, who blocked the building of new bridges across the Thames. There were no other crossings downstream, and the nearest bridge upstream was over 20 miles away in Kingston upon Thames. However, by the mid-18th century, new bridges were being proposed, with the first at Westminster in 1750. Ironically, the first Westminster Bridge also started to collapse because of subsidence, and was dubbed the Bridge of Fools. Corners were cut in its construction, and several of the piers had to be rebuilt, and was finally demolished completely and replaced in 1862. Eventually, in the 1820s, the decision was finally made to replace London Bridge with Rennie's Bridge, as we saw earlier. 5,000 people a day came to watch the demolition. The new bridge was built slightly to the left of the old one, and the long history of the bridge constantly falling down came to an end. So what about the rest of the rhyme? Who is the fair lady, or the Lady Lee, and how does this link to people being buried alive? There are 5 possible answers from the nursery rhyme anthologies, so let's explore them in turn. The first suggestion is the fair lady is the Virgin Mary. The Viking attack we discussed earlier apparently took place on the 7th of September, the traditional birth of the Virgin Mary. My response to this is, it doesn't really sound very likely to me. Remember, the oldest version of the rhyme talks about a Lady Lee, not a fair lady, and I doubt the Virgin Mary will be the focus of a jolly dance in Protestant Georgian England. Theory 2 is that it might be Matilda of Scotland, the Queen Consort of Henry I in the 11th century, who was responsible for the building of a series of bridges over the River Lee. The Lee is a tributary of the Thames and enters the river a little way downstream from London Bridge. Again, this theory seems a little too perfect for me. Was Matilda really that famous for a song to be sung about her building bridges over a different river 200 years before London Bridge was even famous for having any structural defects? The next option for your consideration is Eleanor of Provence. Now, I sort of like this theory. Eleanor was consort to Henry III, and had custody of the bridge revenues from 1269 to about 1281. When the arches collapsed in 1281 and again in 1282, it was discovered that she spent the money allocated for the maintenance of the bridge on herself, and an already unpopular Eleanor was hated by the London populace. Following this scandal, the bridge revenues were handed over to the Bridge House Estates, an organisation which still exists today. I think this theory sort of works, but only if you totally ignore the Lady Lee bit. Why not use her actual name? So we have two final options linked to Lady Lee. The first is that Lady Lee was a real person, a member of the Lee family of Stoneleigh Park in Warwickshire. Somewhere lost in the mists of time, a Lady Lee, spelt slightly differently, but we might overlook that, was buried alive in the foundations of Stoneleigh Abbey to ensure the building wouldn't fall down. The practice of burying people alive in bridges and buildings to bring good luck might seem grotesque to us today, but was fairly widespread across Europe in the early Middle Ages. The first person to advance the theory for London Bridge was Alice Bertha Gomer in her traditional games of England, Scotland and Ireland in the late 19th century. However, I can't find any evidence of these events ever taking place, and you would have thought there would be some record if a noble family sacrificed their daughter based on superstition as opposed to employing a good structural engineer. Also, I can't really see how any story occurring in a minor stately home in rural Warwickshire links to London Bridge. This seems to be an example of people linking the name Lee, retrospectively, with the rhyme. That said, there have been numerous examples of immurement taking place in English churches in the Middle Ages, and it does take us down an interesting rabbit hole on why it is that bricks and stone won't keep a bridge standing. There most certainly are examples of animals being bricked up, so potentially the final verse about the dog being tied up and watching over the bridge may refer to this practice. The final theory is the most straightforward, and for me perhaps that makes it the most likely, that while London Bridge was constantly in need of repair and congested by traffic, people were able to dance over the river Lady Lee, and so ridiculing the London Corporation for its poor efforts in maintaining the bridge. Well, which theory do you think is most plausible? Write in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video on the history of London Bridge and the history of the rhyme. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. There'll be lots more videos coming very soon. Bye for now.